In the last video, we looked at setting up a runtime that would be used for transferring data from a Azure resource to, or format a resource, I should say, to a resource that we run on our own, such as a server. And so in this video, we are going to be looking at how to connect a data factory or another data factory to this. Now, in the previous video, we set that up for a data factory. Now we're going to be connecting a second data factory. So we'll, for the sake of this video, call our second data factory, and our first data factory would be the one that would be running our current runtime. So we see our runtime listed. If we go to our first data factory, go to connections, and we click on integration runtimes, we'll see it listed. And what we want to first do when we want to connect another data factory to this runtime is we first want to actually give it permissions. And so the way we're going to do that is we're going to click on the runtime itself. So if we go back, we'll click on this runtime. When the runtime pulls up, it will actually pull up under settings. We're going to click the button sharing here. And when we click the button sharing, we're going to grant permission to another data factory. And so that's where we're actually going to see a data factory, our second data factory, I should say. We may have more, but let's say that the second data factory is the one that we're trying to connect. That's the one that we'll see. We'll grant that permission. So it will have access. And by the way, you will get an error if you skip this and let's say you just copy the resource ID, because that's the next step. But if you skip this, you're going to get an error that it can't actually find the runtime, and that's because it doesn't have permission to access it. So once we grant the permission, it will be listed here on that, and then of course we're going to copy the resource ID, and we're going to use the resource ID when we go to the second runtime. So when we go to our second Azure data factory, or data factory number 2, we're going to go through the same integration runtime setup, and we're going to still click on the Azure self-hosted. So when we go through this setup, we're going back. I'm going to go back really fast because it's on the screen. We're going back to that new. The only difference is we're not going to see a runtime on this screen. So we're going to be clicking new to the integration runtimes, and we'll have those options come up. We're either going to do Azure SSIS or Azure self-hosted. We're going to click on self-hosted. Once we click on self-hosted, we're going to do the link self-hosted. So this is one of the reasons why we want to do the sharing. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to find the data factory. And then once we click on the link self-hosted, we're going to give it a name, which in this case, we're going to use the same name. And yes, you can use the same name. And then we're going to copy and paste that resource ID that we got in this other screen. So I'm going to go really back fast to that other screen. We would have gotten a resource ID here. Of course, obviously it's edited out for security purposes, but we would have gotten a resource ID here. Once we get that resource ID, we're going to copy it here as well. Again, you can use the exact same name, and it is definitely more convenient to do that way for organization purposes, especially depending on how the design is. And of course, this type is self-hosted linked. So we're not creating another self-hosted. We're going to be using the existing one. It is true that if we wanted to set up a new one, for instance, if we wanted to set up another runtime, then we would go through the steps that we followed in the other video. But in this case, we're linking it to an existing one that we already have.